I want to talk a little bit about Edmund Burke and the notion of the sublime, which ties in both to Dracula and to Freud. Burke is writing, it's published around 1757, so he comes in quite a bit earlier, way ahead certainly of Jung and Freud, and way ahead of Stoker and Dracula as well. However, there are some important philosophical concepts in Burke that I want to talk about. Most notably is the notion of the sublime. And Burke talks about the power of the sublime, its ability to basically send the mind into a paroxysm of stunned, overwhelmed silence. It comes from a number of places, but essentially it is a combination of fear and either joy or excitement slash exhilaration all at the same time. So one of the metaphors I like to use to talk about Burke's notion of the sublime would be standing, if you know of Niagara Falls, and there's a rail that goes right up to the edge of Niagara Falls, and you can actually, on the Canadian side, you can actually look straight down Niagara Falls by holding onto this railing. And if you lean over the railing just a wee little bit, you get dizzy with the power of all this water rushing over, and you experience conflicting emotions at the same time. You experience exhilaration and joy and pleasure, but also sheer terror that if you fell or if you slipped and fell, you would be dead. And so this combination of pleasure slash exhilaration and fear are what defines Burke's notion of the sublime. And it's very important to Dracula because every encounter with Dracula is a moment of the sublime. And if you think about Jonathan Harker's experience with the three vampiresses, he is both enjoying it on the one hand and terrified of those awful women, quote unquote, as he calls them. So that is certainly a sublime moment. Now, Burke's notion of the sublime also ties into Freud because, and let me back up and preface this for a moment. Burke is writing, 150 plus years before Freud. So it's very anachronistic to suggest that these texts are connected in this way. I'm only suggesting that what Burke calls the sublime is what Freud would call the return of the repressed. That is to say that when we have repressed certain anxieties and gone on with our lives, the superego asserts itself over the id, and we think we're okay, but then we keep encountering in our lives symbols of that which has been repressed that keep surfacing in our lives. Freud, Dracula, and Burke all sort of come together in this notion of the sublime, or the return of the repressed, as Freud would say it. So for Burke, the sublime is anything that excites the idea of pain and danger together on the one hand. That is to say, what is in any sort terrible is the source of the sublime. So it has to have some sense of fear or anxiety about it. And he said that it is productive of the strongest emotion of which the mind is capable of feeling. And what he's talking about here, of course, is a combination of fear and exhilaration. And that is what, for Freud, is one of the primal instincts that we all sort of carry with us. So he says, ideas of pain also, and this is the second part of his hypothesis, that pain is a much more powerful motivator and leaves a deeper impression on our mind than pleasure. Without all doubt, the torments which we may be made to suffer are much greater in their effect of the body and the mind than any pleasure that the most learned voluptuary could suggest. A voluptuary is person who's devoted his or her life to the exclusively to the pursuit of pleasure. And so down here he says, but as pain is in its operation stronger in its operation than pleasure, so death is in general a much more affecting idea, that is, say, emotional idea, than pain. Because there are very few pains, however exquisite, which are not preferred to death. So there's a kind of gradation here of uncomfortable things, and fear and avoidance of pain are on a continuum, and the extreme part of that continuum is fear of death. This is what Freud calls thanatos, and so Burke's notion of fear and death together being somehow related and associated with pain and discomfort anticipates Freud's notion of the a couple of those primal instincts anyway. So here, and I suspect I don't know if he's talking about males or about humankind. I can't tell, but let's take it at face value. Men are at all times pretty equally disposed to the pleasures of love, because they are to be guided by reason in the time and manner indulging them, meaning that the way in which we conduct our lives is what he calls reason, is what Freud would call the superego. So we live our lives rationally, that is to say that we do not seek pleasure every moment of every working day, but we learn with the faculty of reason, superego, to allocate certain times for pleasure and certain times for work. And so we don't indulge in pleasures generally unless there's, some consent of the superego. But brutes who obey laws in the execution which their own reason has little share, he's talking here about instinct, animal instinct, where they just do things in their stated season. So mating season, and they do what they have to do. At such times it's not improbable that the sensation from the want is very troublesome. So the absence of pleasure in our lives occasionally will drive us past the point where reason can control things. That's, in Freudian terms, that's another way of saying, we live our lives mostly in the superego mode, but occasionally the id takes over and we are compelled, reason or no reason, superego or no superego, to yield to the id. This quote, "The passion which belongs to generation is merely as such as lust only." Generation doesn't mean a particular age group in a population. He means the generation of life. So what he's talking about here is what Freud would call id or libido, a sexual drive, which belongs to, let's call it procreation. Merely as such is lust only. So this impulse, let's not confuse lust necessarily with other kinds of pleasure. Okay. A passion caused by the great and sublime in nature. And here, think about Wordsworth going into the countryside and so on. This is a very romantic notion that when we see things in nature that are both large in scale and overwhelming, let's take the example I've been using of Niagara Falls, when those two things come together, we experience what he calls astonishment. And it's a state of the soul in which all motions are suspended with some degree of horror. So this is that state of paralysis that I'm talking about. That when that one of the steps on the way to the sublime experience is astonishment, or to put it another way, what a sublime experience does is trigger astonishment in our minds. What is astonishment? We are lost for words. We cannot articulate what we're feeling. We are, to some degree, horrified by what we are experiencing. Think of Mina, when Dracula breaks into the bedroom and forces her to suck blood from his chest. Think of Jonathan Harker in these trances where he is kind of spellbound against his own will. That's the notion of astonishment. And what is particularly terrifying about it for the adult as an individual, and what is particularly terrifying about it for a quote-unquote civilized society, because don't forget, civilized societies look down on folk cultures and say, well, they're primitive people, they don't know really what they're doing. But when we experience this astonishment, we are genuinely horrified and paralyzed. In this case, the mind is so entirely filled with its object that it cannot entertain any other, nor by consequence reason on that object which employs it. You cannot reason your way out of it. And this is one of the great anxieties of Western civilization, that the rational control we have in our lives as adults and the power that civilization, particularly mercantile capitalism, industrial capitalism, and corporate capitalism, the power that those civilizations have created makes them appear to be so much more superior to the folk cultures of the Arawak and the various tribes in the Caribbean. It creates a kind of arrogance in civilization, and Dracula is a nightmare dream that the so-called superiority that Western civilization thinks it has may not be true. All right, so terror, no passion that so affectionately robs the mind of all of its powers as acting and reasoning as fear. And fear, definition, is the apprehension of pain or death. And so the way this process works is we encounter a sublime stimulus. We are led into an induced state of astonishment. That is to say, we are overwhelmed. And it's a kind of, if you'll forgive me putting it this way, but it's a kind of paralyzing fear that overcomes us and takes away our ability to think, to act, and to reason. Part of what makes it terrifying is obscurity. That is to say, where we can't see the whole thing in and of itself. We can't really understand the whole dimension. So in the example I talked about Niagara Falls, you can't really see the bottom from the top, and you can't see the power of the whole Niagara Falls. You'd actually have to be at the base of the falls looking up to see that. So part of the sublime and the terror and the astonishment that goes with it is not being able to see completely. And when you can't see, situations become more terrifying. I just want you to cast your minds back to Othello when they're on the island of Cyprus, and the people on shore can't tell how many ships are out there, whether they're coming or going, whether the ships are friendly or hostile. There's that famous line where you can't tell where the ocean ends and the sky begins. And so all of those kinds of experiences add up to terror and to fear. For Freud, these are, as I say, moments of recognition where the unconscious mind meets the conscious mind, and we have a moment where the ego, which is the self, can actually understand part of who it is. So down here, sublimity is principally due to the terrible uncertainty of things described. You don't know what it is. It's the unknown, and that's why Dracula is such a sublime entity, because he is undefinable. He is us, he is not us, he is alive, he is not alive, he's dead, he's an aristocrat, he's not an aristocrat, he's a foreigner, yet he knows his way around London. These are all sort of contrary qualities that he has that help define define the fear of the unknown that is associated with him. And finally, we come now to the notion of power. And what Burke is about to say is that you cannot experience a sublime moment with astonishment and fear unless you realize that you are in the presence of a power greater than yourself. Put another way, this means vulnerability. Put another way, this is the adult reliving childhood nightmares. Or this is the rational, highly educated, sophisticated, civilized society of industrial capitalism, imagining itself as a folk culture, like the Arawak or one of those Caribbean tribes, that worships deities out of fear, and that is always reminded of how vulnerable human beings are. See, that's the thing about a folk culture, is because you don't have access to food all the time, and because you are constantly being reminded that the forces of nature are more powerful than you are, as a human being and as a society, you're always aware that you are not the greatest things in sliced bread, that nature can come along and in an instant wipe you out or do damage to you in ways over which you have no control. That is a way of life for folk societies, but for civilizations, Western civilizations who have repressed collectively as a society, have repressed that fear and that vulnerability. The anxiety of what you repressed always comes back to you. This is Freudian, right? So that the way it works for an individual is the way it works for the whole society. The more society represses its vulnerability and keeps insisting that it is not a primitive folk culture, the more it's going to fear the return of the repressed. And where does the return of the repressed come? In our sleep. When the superego is asleep and dismantled, disconnected, that's when the id and all of those other primal emotions rise up to us and bring us the terror that we so deeply fear. So Burke's notion of the sublime coming back basically to suggest danger and to suggest being overwhelmed and astonished at what we see. All of that is what Freud sees as the unconscious. And it all comes together in Dracula, because Dracula is basically the neurosis of an entire civilization. Jonathan Harker is the neurosis of an individual. That's the ontogenesis, that, as Freud would call it, of the individual. But the phylogenesis, the phylogenetic, the whole culture is what we can experience as a collective group of people. And so the sublime, just like Freud, applies to both individuals and an entire civilization.